Rockabye Daisy. Daisy was waiting for James to arrive at the junction. Just as she heard his whistle, "You look cheerful today," she said. "Mrs. Percival just had twins a few days ago," replied James. "Congratulations to her," said Daisy with pleasant. Mrs. Percival was pleasant to see Daisy as she stepped out of James's coaches and boarded her. The guard blew the whistle, and she rolled carefully out of the station. Daisy knew that babies don't like rough rides. After Toby told her she needed to be gentle with them. Meanwhile, after a great deal of keeping her passengers on the train on time, Daisy was resting at Farquhar. She watched it in the sidings as Mrs. Percival left her baby carriage on the side of the photo booth. I need to make a quick phone call before we get on board," she told her children. She was on the phone just as Thomas arrived at the platform. Coupled to Annie and Clever, the passengers went on board, and the porter put all the luggage inside. He saw the baby's carriage and thought it belonged to the passengers on board. Without thinking, he pushed the baby's carriage inside Claire Bell. Not long now, thought Thomas, as all the doors were closed. Claire Bell, on the other hand, noticed that the baby's carriage belonged to Mrs. Percival, but the guard's whistle blew and Thomas steamed away. Stop! 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 She wailed, but Thomas didn't hear her. Daisy was watching and noticed the baby's carriage wasn't on the platform. Mrs. Percival stepped out and saw the baby carriage was gone. "Oh no!" she cried. "What happened to Pansy and Patrick?" The porter heard her. "Oh no," he said. "It was my fault. I thought the carriage belonged to passengers on Thomas's train." "How we could stop him?" said Mrs. Percival. "The next passenger train isn't due until 3 o'clock. Daisy heard this. "I'll take you to Mayfleet," she called. "And tell the station master to phone the other station masters," replied the porter. Daisy went on the platform just as Mrs. Percival was on board. Daisy was at the platform just as Mrs. Percival boarded her and waited for the porter. "You're free to go now," he said, as he opened the door in the station, and Daisy rolled away. Meanwhile, Thomas was steaming along his branch road to Mayfleet. "Come along, you two, we mustn't be late. Come along, you two, we must be late." But Clara didn't want to. We took Mrs. Percival's carriage. We took Mrs. Percival's carriage," she wailed, and he tried to tell Thomas too. And we have Mrs. Percival's carriage. We have Mrs. Percival's carriage. But he was in a hurry and didn't listen. Annie and Clara tried to put on the brakes, but they couldn't. "We took Mrs. Percival's niece's carriage. We took Mrs. Percival's niece's carriage," they cried. Then Thomas saw a red flag at Mayfleet station up ahead. "Whoa, Thomas," he said, and shut off steam. "Bother that flag," said Thomas. "What's going on?" "I don't know," replied his driver. "We'll find out soon." They waited and waited, but they couldn't go. "What's taking so long?" whistled Thomas. "We took Mrs. Percival's carriage by mistake," said Annie and Clara together. "They're right," said the porter. "We just got a call from the station master at Frogheart. The porters pushed the carriage into Clara by mistake." And he pulled out. Daisy arrived with Mrs. Percival and can only smile. "Looks like you accidentally took to Mrs. Percival's twins, she said to Thomas. Thomas was really embarrassed. "I'm really sorry," he thought. "It's okay. It happens," replied Mrs. Percival regardlessly. As the signal was green for Thomas, he set off carefully to Elsbridge, and Mrs. Percival reunited with the twins, and she gave a gentle hug as she held on to them. At Elsbridge, Daisy dropped off as Emily arrived. "Thank you for saving Pansy and Patrick," she said. "Well, I wouldn't look after over for them without you." "Of course, ma'am," said Daisy. They were on board Emily's coaches, and she steamed away. "You're a really useful radio car. You're a really useful rail car, Daisy," said Emily, and they set off until she was out of sight. Daisy felt pleased with herself as she went back to her shed. She'd saved the narrow gauge's control's wife children for getting lost and separated.